Hello, everyone. Welcome back or welcome to the Human Condition podcast. I know it's been quite a while. As I was watching the James Webb Telescope shoot into the sky, realizing that it's going to travel for an entire month to reach an orbit that's 1,000,000 miles away from the Earth, where it's going to stare into the night sky and ponder about the very beginnings of the universe that we live in, I couldn't help but wonder, how the fuck are we able to do this? Well, one of the reasons why we're able to do this is because we have mapped our sky to an extraordinarily precise degree. We have mapped our planet, our solar system, and millions of other stars, which are trillions, if not quadrillions of kilometers away. Of course, we needed staggeringly complex mathematics and physics to achieve this, but the thing I want to talk about today is the medium through which we portray this, which are maps. I've recently taken an interest in maps and cartography, so I wanted to talk a little bit about this. Cartography is the art of creating maps. To be honest, most of my life I've been quite terrible at understanding maps and locating places on it, perhaps because I was never really interested in maps. I never really looked at maps as something other than drawings on a piece of paper with names attached to it. But now that I've been thinking about maps and what they represent, I found maps to be a very fascinating way to think about our world in terms of geography, history, and the way we perceive the world itself. Because maps aren't just a bunch of coordinates or geographical representations of what exists on a piece of paper. Surely they are that, but they're also much more than that. They signify the relationship we have with our surroundings and how we view the world. The celestial maps of planets and solar system define our understanding of our place as humans in this universe. The maps of countries and borders we see on Google Earth or any other political world map tell us about the history of how these countries turned out to be. When we look at these ancient maps, like the first world map created on a clay tablet by the ancient Babylonians, we can understand what their perception of the world was at the time and how they looked at the world. For them, the world just consisted of the Babylonian kingdom, and cutting along it were the mighty Euphrates and the Tigris rivers that fed the alluvial lowlands of Mesopotamia, all of it encompassed by the ocean. When we look at a map of Imola, created by Leonardo da Vinci, which was the first of its kind with a top view or an aerial view portrayal of the city that's drawn perpendicular to the Earth's surface, we understand their keenness on improving the surveillance and fortifications within the city. And this military map represents and tells us about the advancements in warcraft at the time. The nautical map made in the 15th century by Zheng He of China's Ming dynasty tells us about the ambitious maritime expeditions of our ancestors. The maps of the heavens and earth made by the Muslim astronomers and scholars of the 11th century give us a medieval Islamic perspective on the nature of their heavens and their God. So you see, maps aren't just points and names on a piece of paper. Maps to me seem like a very integral part of human progress, human understanding, and our curiosity to position things and represent them as we see it. It seems like people used maps to orient themselves and their beliefs, and that's why there were all sorts of maps. We have celestial maps, religious maps, military maps, nautical maps, maps of trade routes, and in the modern day, we also have imaginary maps or fantasy maps, building spectacular worlds like the Middle-earth or the Westeros, and tons of Dungeons and Dragon battle maps. I think that's because humans are visual beings, and we are visual learners. We love to see pictures of things and visual representations of them, so it's no wonder that we needed maps since the ancient times for important stuff like trade routes or hunting grounds or even military battlefields. In this episode, I want to talk through some historical perspectives about maps and their historical significance. Some of the earliest maps date back to 16,000 BC, and they're obviously from ancient Babylonia, arguably the most advanced civilization of the time. These maps were mostly done on clay tablets, and they even had a map of the entire world, which is the oldest world map we know, dating around 600 BC. Maps over the years have been made on all kinds of materials, starting with clay, animal skin, papyrus, mosaic, paper, and the more modern digital versions. But when you think of it, how did the ancient map makers even figure out how to map their cities and states, let alone the whole world? Well, simply put, if you could just measure the coordinates, that is, the latitude and the longitude of different locations, by following the shore, mapping these coordinates, and connecting the points, you can roughly get an outline of any place, be it a city, state, or a continent. But first, they needed to understand that the earth is spherical, because someone who believes that the earth is flat would run into problems because the longitudes, which are these imaginary lines that run across the earth vertically, are not parallel lines. They meet at the north and south poles. So if you start mapping with the assumption that the earth is flat, your map will be wildly inaccurate. The ancient Greeks understood this. They figured out that the earth was somewhat spherical, which allowed Ptolemy, with a silent P, the Greek mathematician, to plot out a world map with latitudes and longitudes. This map stretched from the Canary Islands in the west to what is now modern Korea in the east. Of course, Ptolemy's map was still wildly inaccurate. There were no Americas in his map. He drastically overestimates the size of the Mediterranean Sea and falls way short on the estimate for the Earth's circumference. But it was still something, His map served as a template for geographers and map makers around the world for centuries to come. Today many of us use maps on a very regular basis, be it for navigating from one place to another, traveling to a different city or country, or perhaps you're accustomed to browsing randomly on Google Earth, like me. But the purpose of why we use maps has been ever changing since the time the ancient Mesopotamians first started mapping. In the times when empires were trying to expand their territories and establish authority and power over different regions, maps were commissioned by the emperors as a memento of their imperial grandeur. These maps were not made for the common people or the proletariat. They were only used by the elite, the emperors, the scholars, and the holy men. It wasn't until the 13th or the 14th century that maps and cartography became more accessible and were used by sailors, merchants, and architects. Maps were also used for political reasons as part of the narrative. Cartographic propaganda was a thing in those days. If you can get cartographers to map your region in a way that would attract more trade and more economy, that would benefit your empire, right? In fact, that is what happened in the year 1529. The Spanish and the Portuguese were in dispute over the region of the Spice Islands at the time. So the Spanish authorities commissioned Diego Ribeiro, a Portuguese cartographer, to make a world map. They paid him off to show that the Maluku Islands, or the Spice Islands, fell within the Spanish territory. And spices at the time, as you may know, were absolutely precious. Although this was done as part of the cartographic propaganda, it was still one of the first decently accurate world maps given the standards of the day. There were also other motivations for maps to be made. I think I already mentioned Leonardo da Vinci's map of Imola, which was a military map showing the fortifications of the city of Bologna. Emperors needed to conquer, defend, and rule over their territories, and for that they needed maps to assess the weaknesses in their fortifications. So maps also served a military purpose. Maps were also used for navigation, obviously. The period between the late 14th century and the early 16th century was one with remarkable changes in culture, art, science, and exploration. And that's why it's probably known as the Age of Discovery. The European, Ottoman, and Chinese explorers began traveling to new places, and for that they needed maps to navigate the lands. But maps still weren't widely available to everyone. However, this slowly changed around the 17th century, and maps became a lot more common. They weren't just available to the scholars and emperors anymore. Cartography became a serious profession and a more specialized one. During this time, the Gutenberg printing press was invented, which exploded the print and media scene at the time. Maps could now be printed in large numbers, and the common folk had access to them. The Cassini family came up with a comprehensive map of France, which was the first of its kind and was also well received by the French Republicans during and after the French Revolution of 1789, which was the one event that fueled the rise of nationalism across Europe. They used this map to promote it as a symbol of their nation and one that is free of monarchy. Somewhere along the line, though, as the world was explored more and more and the geography of it became more explicable, the role of map makers changed from that of an artist or a savant to a more administrative one, merely filling in the blanks across the Earth's surface. Moving on a few hundred years, today, in the 21st century, maps have swapped paper for pixels, and we use digital maps on a near daily basis. The development of geographical information systems, or GIS, since the 1960s gave maps a new range of features and scope for unprecedented detail. A few decades later, in the early 2000s, the real game changer of today's cartographical world came in the form of Google Earth or TerraVision, depending on which story you want to believe. For those who haven't seen the Netflix show The $1 Billion Code, it's about these two German engineers who in the 1990s came up with this primitive model of what we know today as Google Earth. They named it TerraVision, and it supposedly shares a striking similarity with Google Earth. But as the show goes, Google kind of ripped them off and won the lawsuit, claiming that they didn't really infringe any patent or copy anything from TerraVision. I thought it was a very interesting show, and they also explained some of the cartographical techniques they used to make Google Earth, and it might be fun to check it out if you're interested in the concepts of map making. Alright, I went off on a tangent, but now I want to talk about the importance of maps in one of my favorite historical avenues, and one that lasted over 1,000 years. I'm talking about the story of the Silk Road. Without maps, the establishment of the Silk Road simply would not be possible. The Silk Road was a trans-Eurasian network of trade routes connecting East and Southeast Asia to Central Asia, India, Southwest Asia, the Mediterranean, and Northern Europe. It was a network that enabled a distance of more than 1,600 miles to be covered in the course of a week, which at the time was absolutely mind-blowing. But in truth, it was more than just a trade route. It was a road for religions to spread. It was a road for languages to be exchanged and cultures to be incorporated. It was a road to a Christian East. It was the road to a Hellenistic West, where the Greek ideas and themes were introduced widely throughout Europe. It was a road where slaves were exchanged and slavery was rampant. It was a road where diseases were exchanged. It was a road of death and destruction. It was a road to gold and silver, crisis and war, heaven and hell. Now, don't get me mistaken. When I say road, the Silk Road wasn't one single road, but more like a network of roads or routes. This to me is one of the most fascinating avenues of history because so much of the modern world has evolved as a result of what happened on the Silk Roads. The world as we know it today would certainly be very different and probably be set back a few hundred years had it not been for the establishment of the Silk Roads. This trade network lasted over 1,500 years from the time the Han dynasty of China opened trade with the West till the time the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century decided to stop trade with the West. The thing with this period, which is often known as the Dark Ages, is that a lot of knowledge about this age has been lost. And for some reason, the learning centers of Asia and Europe at the time somehow couldn't cope with copying and translating ancient scriptures. This was until the Renaissance period, where knowledge once again was intensified. The little we know about Silk Roads is because of people like Aurel Stein. Aurel Stein was one of the greatest contributors to the British Museum. In the 19th century, Stein met a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had accidentally discovered around 40,000 manuscripts and documents written in various Silk Road languages that were hidden in some caves for anywhere between 700 to 900 years. Stein convinced Wang to accept a generous contribution towards its community in exchange for several cartloads of these ancient documents, which were then transported to London and now sit in several museums. The sheer number of languages in these documents tell us how widely the Silk Road was used and how significant a role it played in cultural expansion. I know I haven't spoken much about maps in this last section, but most, if not all, the routes of the Silk Road were carefully mapped and passed on to their fellow traders and merchants, which is how the Silk Road became so heavily used and populated. So ultimately, the importance of maps in the establishment of the Silk Road cannot be understated. So from Ptolemy's wild imagination, making him draw the first world map on a piece of clay, to today's Google Earth, which offers us a three-dimensional view of the Earth, letting us pan, zoom, rotate and tilt the view of the Earth, we came a long way in the realm of cartography and, more importantly, understanding the world around us. People, even a few hundred years ago, didn't know what the landscape around them looked like or where exactly they were located on the Earth, whereas a child today knows where they are on this planet to such an accurate degree that they can locate themselves with pinpoint accuracy using an app. We know the landscape around us, the countries, the volcanoes, the deserts, the rivers and lakes, and the oceans around us. We have a much greater and clearer understanding of our surroundings, and we have maps to thank for it. I hope you found this episode interesting. I certainly did, and if you want to talk about maps more, you can just hit me up and I'd be glad to talk about it. Cool. Thank you.